Well, I'd like to first welcome so many people coming here from English, which is new. I'm the chair of the Department of Design, Media Arts, and one of the purposes of this space is actually to mix disciplines and promote hybrids, such as Marjorie's work. And everything we do is streamed live, so we actually have an audience watching us right now, and everything is archived too. So if you're interested in seeing our past speakers, or even reviewing what was talked about tonight, just log on to our website and it'll be there. And now I would like to introduce to you Toni Dove, who's here from New York. She is a performance and installation artist, working with narrative actually, so I think it'll be interesting for you to see how an artist who works with film and interactive media breaks down the narrative and looks at actually developing new technologies in order to do that. She's worked on she is actually working on a trilogy, the first of which is the Artificial Changelings, which I believe she'll show tonight. And perhaps we get a peek into the new project. She came in with a script that she wrote, so artists are now actually in a position where we have to write, and those that are able to write and articulate their ideas and philosophies about the work are able to make that jump into the new media and collaboration. So please help me welcome Toni Dove.
Hi. I work in a medium that doesn't exist yet. Sometimes I say I wanted to write a song and I found I had to build a piano. And so I'm now a piano factory for writing stories. What I'm going to do, I'm going to start out by showing a video of Artificial Changelings, which is a recently completed piece that is an interactive narrative installation, an interactive movie. And I have a prepared talk, but I think I'm going to wing it a little bit, so I may ignore it. So you, bear with me, and I'll be maybe not exactly linear. So Artificial Changelings is an interactive installation. It uses video motion sensing, which allows physical movement to alter a character, to move their body, generate speech, change the soundtrack. So there's about the video demo is about 12 minutes, and then I'll talk more about the piece and and about the whole concept of interface design and where it's coming out of for me, and I'll talk a little bit about the new piece that I'm working on and how my piano is evolving. And can you cut the lights on that for the moment, or is that possible?
Mostly she stole things she didn't need, things she didn't even want, really. She stole when she was about to be nervous or sad. She stole when she was excited, and she stole just for the kick of it. There must have been an erotic thrill in the danger, in that moment when she might get caught, but didn't. And of course, there was the collection of unimportant things. What were they for? Was there someone she wished to replace with useless things and a feeling of triumph? The department store had become her lover. In secret, she sliced through the surface of her skin, watching blood flow from the tiny openings. At night she had dreams, rich with passion and vengeance. Artificial Changelings is an interactive narrative installation that uses video motion sensing to track the location and movement of a viewer standing in front of an image projected on a screen. The movement is translated into changes in picture and sound. There are 4 zones. Walking close to the screen into Zone 1 puts the viewer inside a character's head. Zone 2 places you in direct relationship to the character, as if in conversation. Zone 3 is a trance or dream space. The 4th zone is a time tunnel. One must pass through the 4th zone and re-enter the dream space to arrive in the other century of the story. Physical movement within each zone alters the video and sound in a variety of ways. It may generate speech, change the emotional tone of the sound environment, or move a character's body.
What I have to tell you is so dreadful. I should not have the courage. I went to the shop to buy various things. I lost all sense of courage. One to make such an confession seems such a slippery turn in the face of such seduction.
It was I who took it. He didn't stole it. It was I who took it. He didn't stole it.
All the time, inside, there was someone else trying to get out. Someone who wanted to speak. A child beating on the walls. At night she dreamt about a young woman in the distant future who did more than steal. This woman was an anarchist. She could see her silhouetted against the sky. It was a foreign sky of strange colors, and all around the woman, whose name was Zilith, was a structure. A house that lived and breathed. This house was like a circulatory system, a living thing, a huge electronically simulated organism that looked like it was made from wire and light, and Zilith stood inside it and seemed to be covered with something like a wireframe herself. Arathus appeared closer in the haze of the dream and saw that Zilith was dressed in a corset or vest and panniers made from something unfamiliar that looked like 18th century undergarments, but encased her body like protective armor. What had been inside had turned out. Zilith crept quietly into the underground chamber, peering into the darkness to be certain that she was alone and undetected. She reached in back of the apparatus that wrapped around her body like mutated panniers and tugged on the recycled fishnet bustle so clunky. There wasn't a degree highway that could do the whole thing in my pinky ring. Trickle down, the little molecular microchips. We'll get up ahead of steam and see what shape the highways are in. What body part neural shall I mount to my fingertips? Nothing too distracting. I'm an eavesdropper today.
She is hacking routers, taking over data paths, and passing through gates by decrypting secret keys to map the invisible loci of power. A researcher of distribution in the information market. A virtual urban planner from the informal sector. The air hums with the sound of cash registers ringing and shoppers purchasing goods. Her heart beating and adrenaline pumping through her system, Arethusa reaches for the sugared fruits. She clutches the trophy and stuffs it into her bag. The sugar leaves a sticky film on her fingers and stains the interior silk a dark blackish red, like the color of dried blood. More trinkets follow. Her head feels as if it would explode, and a sensation like an electric wave rolls through her body.
I must be away and clear. I am almost free. And the release. It is like flying. I could do anything. I almost feel that I could fly.
Design a profile for you. Perfect cutout and personalities.
This is some footage of the installation.
Liquefy it. Emulsify.
At the Wexner Center for the Arts. This woman's physical movement, if she stopped moving, the screen would stop and there would be no speech. So her movement is actually causing the character to move and speak. Now, as the camera moves away from the screen down to the floor pads, there's pads on the floor. Here she stepped on the time tunnel. It flashes. There's a video segment that plays, and it will move up to the dream space. This is the third zone, which is the dream space. And so you enter the other century of the story through the dream space. So as she steps onto that space, her physical movement now, any kind of movement, is actually causing the character to move and causing the speech to happen. Again, if she stopped, everything would freeze and it would be silent. Now, in this segment, she's in close-up, which means she's either inside a character's head or very close to her body. In this, her physical movement is completely creating the soundtrack, and it's causing the video. It's also causing the video to move and change speed and direction. Character is kind of shadow boxing with an image on the wall. And her movements are making her spin and turn. This footage was shot at an opening, so that's why there's all the kind of cocktail conversation. Now you can see how it moves when she moves, and then if it freezes, it stops. I've noticed that children need less explanation about how to use the interface than anyone. You just say, like, wave your arms, move back and forth. They take it from there. If some of you notice that the costume on the character in the future look vaguely familiar, it's because she's actually wearing football shoulder pads around her waist, and they've been outfitted with hydraulic pistons. So when she does that thing with a brass-tipped evening glove, it's actually causing the layers of the shoulder pads to flap like castanets. So the actress so she could kind of play the costume like castanets, and it would flap around and the pistons would work. It was attached to a CO2 tank and a power supply. So Artificial Changelings started as a piece on architecture and underwear, about the institutions and cultural mythologies that mold subjectivity within the cycles of exchange. It seemed that in my research, from the early mobilized gaze of the panorama and the arcades to cryptography and evolving network technologies, from hierarchical structures to new formations for power relations, everything kept returning to shopping. Merchandising and the transformation of information into commodity. Concomitant with this escalation of commodification from the Industrial Revolution to the current moment of technological transition seems to be a depletion of experience leading to longing, the longing for something to give it back. The installation of Artificial Changelings consists of a curved rear projection screen with the floor pads, and as you noticed in the video, with the floor pads that navigate you through the piece, and physical movement that causes your body to get kind of stuck to the character's body. And this is one of the things that really interested me as I started developing this piece, was the problem of taking the syntax, the sort of existing syntax of cinematography, because I'm a movie buff and I like to sit in the third row, and I think a lot of you out there probably do too. You know, and thinking about how to rethink some of those, some of that syntax in order to make the experience more immersive and to basically embody the experience. And when I started out initially, the first interactive piece that I did was a virtual reality murder mystery that I did at the Banff Center for the Arts. And it used a headset, but it used a Polymus tracker and a kind of camera that let you look around the space, and a glove that let you, pick up things in the space, and it was real-time computer graphics. And the thing that bugged me about it, aside from the fact that all the equipment was really expensive and hard to get to go anywhere except, the one place that it started out, what bugged me about it was that there was all this apparatus hanging off you all the time, so you were always like hooked up to something. And so I wanted to play around with the idea of developing a more transparent interface, something that would that would give you the experience of your body extending into the movie. And I think that this charged space between the body and the screen is a really significant space within the whole context of interactive media for a couple of reasons. One, because I think there's a whole spectrum of technologies currently evolving, from ATM machines to internet technology, that are giving us an experience of telepresence and giving us an experience of the doubled body or the extruded body or the extended body, basically giving us a kind of pedestrian, ordinary, everyday experience of the body extending beyond its boundaries, and I think that that's recasting a whole raft of discourses on the invisible, which I think are very interesting. I think it's very interesting, from the idea of the supernatural and the paranormal, and a lot of the things that have suddenly recurred in popular culture in ways that we haven't seen them for quite a long time. I think this is relating to the notion that these ordinary experiences of telepresence are beginning to alter our concept of what constitutes the body and where our body stops and what its powers are. So I got very interested in working with this interface and in thinking about you know, what kind of ground would be an interesting place against which to go weird, basically. Because within this interface, this, you know, I wanted to create a familiar platform against which to become strange. Because if you create something that's all strange, then that's the platform and it's normal. So if you wanted to create an uncanny experience, and you want that experience of doubling to start to have like a range in the experience of strangeness, then you need something, you need a familiar ground on which to build it. So I wanted to look at cinema as my familiar ground. And to look at some of the kind of basic vocabularies and for constructing cinema, you know, like if you're working with dialogue, for instance, the shot, reverse shot, the fact that it's a cut, you know, that moves you through time. Some of these things that are the kind of basic building blocks that in which film describes time, space, human relationships. And I think that one of the ways in which we're departing from film within the sphere of interactive media and through the notion of telepresence is that we've moved away from the cut into the continuum. And I think that this is important for a number of reasons. One is that that because, well, if you were looking at, for instance, at action movies, an action movie uses the eyes as a kind of trigger into the sensorium of the internet of your own sensorium, and these visual cues orient you in space. So, for instance, if you're looking at an action movie of a roller coaster, you might get that whoop-de-doop feeling in your stomach that, you know, that lets you know that your body is experiencing the visual cues as if your body was actually in that space. But they're visual triggers, and we know they're visual triggers. And what happens to us in that movie scenario is that our bodies kind of disappear mostly. You might get that little whoop-de-doop, but mostly you're not really aware of your body, and you've gone into the screen. You're sort of you become the screen. The screen becomes your point of view. So what I was interested in thinking about is what happens when you embody the viewer in a way so that those cues are not just located in the eyes, but throughout the body, in the voice, in movement, in a whole set of physical experiences, that instead of making you sort of disappear and become the screen, activate the space between the body and the screen. So in other words, you are not only in your body, you're in the screen, you're in your body, and you feel the connection between the two spaces. So suddenly in this piece, the character starts to feel kind of stuck to you, you know, when you move and she moves. And initially I thought, well, the holy grail here is, you know, like I make my arm go like this and she makes her arm go like this, you know, and I thought that would be it, you know, like everything could be like a kind of mirror image, and that would be very strange. It turns out that that's actually kind of boring. And because you figure it out, it becomes completely comprehensible really quickly. So the video motion sensing system that I'm using parses motion below your level of comprehension, below your level of how you perceive motion. We tend to think of gestures as almost like objects. Like if you move your arm, you think of that as a fast motion, or this as a slow motion. But the video motion sensing system picks it up as dead stop, slow escalation, plateau, denouement, you know? So it's getting a whole lot of information. And so it's behaving in ways that your brain can't quite keep up with. And what really interested me about the way that the interface was operating was the way in which, you know, the way in which the character kind of stayed stuck to you, but you couldn't quite tell what it was going to do. It sort of brought it a little bit more into the realm of conversation, you know, because you actually don't want to be able to completely control someone else's conversation coming back to you because it's boring. You want there to be some like unknown factor that allows for, you know, the exchange of communication. So what happened was with this interface is that it keeps slipping away from you. You can sort of, you can kind of see what it's doing, but it keeps slipping away from you. But it never goes away for very long. It comes right back. So you have this sense of this entity that's kind of stuck to you. But you can't really quite tell what it's going to do. If you do this and then you do this again, it doesn't really do the same thing because it's much more sophisticated in its perception of motion than you are. And I got kind of fascinated with this idea of your body haunting the movie, and the idea that you would start to feel yourself in your body and in the screen at the same time, and what that would mean in terms of creating this relationship with a virtual character or with a set of virtual characters. And so what I'm doing now in the new piece that I'm beginning to develop, which is called Spectropia, is to add some different elements to the interface. And I'm starting to work with speech recognition and synthesis, and with vocal commands and vocal triggers, so that you could speak and the system would amplify your voice and then use your voice as a trigger to trigger other sounds. So as your words come out of your mouth, they become kind of transformed and turn into something else. So this is another way of kind of embodying the interface and extending, allowing the viewer to haunt the movie, to become both separate and part of the film. So Spectropia is a serial kind of 40s B-movie length fiction, about like an 80-minute fiction or something that'll be in 3 parts. It's going to be set up as it can either run as an installation in sections, or it can be performed for an audience by performers. And I'm now currently working to try and port both of these pieces and the work that I do into some kind of living room platform, like some kind of game console platform. And I'll tell you a little bit about Spectropia. Spectropia is it's a fiction. It opens in 2099 in England, in a culture where there's no recorded history and saving anything is punishable by law. And Spectropia is a young woman in her teens who has created a garbage holodeck that scans garbage and creates 3-dimensional simulations that she can walk into that talk to her. She has a sidekick that's a duck that's part robot and part animation. And the duck runs a black market business in retro objects. They live in a salvage zone outside. They live in the salvage zone outside of an urban center in England, and the job of the salvage zone is to collect the detritus created by this consumer culture and compact it to lift the island above sea level because the water's rising. But within the context of this salvage zone, which we call the informal sector. There's a whole elaborate structure of black market economy has arisen, which has to do with the sale and manipulation of objects from the past. So in a lot of ways, it's a piece about memory and amnesia. So Spectropia collects. She has a problem that she has to solve, a mystery that she has to solve that has to do with the death of her father and the loss of his inheritance, and she's trying to fix this problem. And so she's researching things from the early part of the century in the 1920s and 30s. And she finds belongings of one young man from 1931 New York City, and she becomes obsessed with him, and she scans him with such intensity that her machine short circuits, and he's there in her studio, caught out of the simulation like a transparent black and white ghost. And they spend a lot of time talking, and at the end of the evening they sit on the edge of the scanner, and she's tired and she shivers, and he takes his virtual 1931 coat and puts it around her shoulders, and there's a flash and a jolt, and she finds herself in 1931. And she's in the body of another woman. She's in the body of a 30-something kind of grown-up Nancy Drew character. And a mystery unfolds in which she has to solve the problem of her father's history, work out a romance that she's having from in the body of another woman, and find a way to get home. So as this mystery unfolds, I'm building a kind of, because this is a more linear project than Artificial Changelings. Artificial Changelings is like a schizophrenic video android with a history. And it's two characters, the Arethusa the kleptomaniac and Zillith the encryption hacker. And Zillith is kind of Arethusa's empowerment dream. And you can move back and forth between the two centuries, and you push on the two characters, and there's a kind of an accretion that happens that is really a kind of, narratively it would be called exposition. So there's as you push on the characters, gradually things about them emerge, and you begin to know a little bit more about who they are and what they're doing. And so it's not, you know, and it's sort of emergent. It involves a number of different constellations of behaviors that are actually very simple behaviors that, when put together in a cluster, form quite complex cross sections that don't repeat. So you could see the piece 10 times, and probably half of it would be new each time, and then depending on which zone you occupied or which register you were in, it could be quite different each time. Now, the piece that I'm working on now, I'm creating a different kind of through line because it's much more of a narrative piece, and I'm thinking about the interactive environments as if they were a kind of architecture of perception. And I'm thinking about perception in terms of the way we orient ourselves in space, the way we orient ourselves in terms of registers of relationship, the idea of interior monologue, the idea of dialogue and conversation, the idea of activity, you know, a number of different ways that have to do with our relationship to ourself, our relationship to other people, and our relationship to space. And so I'm creating these different zones now that you would navigate similarly to the way you would navigate Artificial Changelings, in a way so that they would combine to give you the sense of a kind of spatialized scene. And it involves, there are two people at a time that can be interactive in this piece, and two people might cooperate to create a dialogue, for instance, and if I refuse to talk to someone, it would force the other person's character into a digression loop. So there's a kind of, like, you know, cooperation that has to happen in order for stories to move forward. There's ways in which you have to navigate through action spaces that amplify or diminish the suspense quotient. There's spaces in which this Spectropia simulations come up where you can actually talk to characters who talk back to you using, you know, speech recognition. So that's the general direction that I'm going in, which has to do with trying to develop gradually a kind of transparent and embodied interface, and to work with the idea of genre fiction as allegory, to work with, to create intelligent entertainment that can, you know, access different kinds of layers of critical discourse instead of dumbing down. So, why don't turn it over to some questions.
Just totally I'm not a very technical person, so I might just miss something in the presentation. But I was wondering if you changed the algorithm that you. I mean, I imagine there's some sort of algorithm between movement or whatever speech you're using. Do you shift it throughout does it change at all?
There's certain things that are stable, and then there's a number of different kinds of behaviors. Like there's within the context of Artificial Changelings, there's three basic different types of behaviors. There's speech, in which if you stop moving, the character stops, and then when you start moving, you animate the character, and it causes phrases to emerge from her, and if you move faster, it escalates into, you know, anger or fear or car accidents or whatever. You know, it does different kinds of things. So there's a basic pool of kind of linear sequenced narrative that has interjections that build up, and the more frantic your movement becomes, the more those interjections take over. So that's one kind of, you know, one kind of interactive space that has three zones. So within that space, you would either be inside a character's head, hearing what's happening to her. She'll be talking to you directly, or you'll be in an altered state, in a trance state. Then there are body sections in which your movement completely constructs the sound environment, and it's kind of musical like sound environment. And basically your movement is also changing the speed rate of the video and changing the direction of the video. So there are segments where it's almost like dancing with a character, and those segments are the places where people tend to have what they call an out-of-body experience, but which I would classify as an in-body experience. And then there's narrative. There's more narrative segments. There's clips that where the movement between zones changes, whether it's the voice inside the character's head, a third-person narrative, or a more abstract soundscape, and in which movement adds kind of emotional layers to the sound. So there's three different kinds of environments, and those interact. They're kind of randomly accessed, and then you can move back and forth between the two centuries. So if you go to the time tunnel when you come back, you have that same set of things happening within the video of the other century.
I wonder if you could tell us a little more about the movement recognition algorithms. You mentioned 3 or 4 or 5 rather low-level parsed movements. I'm wondering if there are any higher-level complex patterns of movement that are either recognized or that you'd like to explore.
That's actually a very interesting question, because basically the system that I'm working with is a video motion sensing system, and it was developed by David Rokeby in Toronto. And it basically takes a field of video of a person standing in front of a screen, and you can use 2 cameras, you can use 1 camera, you can figure out a number of different ways to configure how the system will read motion. And then you have basically a kind of two-dimensional depiction of a plane of motion, in which you can break that down and identify it, or cause it to cause interactivity in a whole, with many ways. Like sometimes I would just split the screen in half and say anything that happens on this side moves the video forward, on this side it moves it backwards, and the amount or the speed of motion will change the rate of the video, so it'll go to slow motion and fast motion. But there's many things that you can do in terms of configuring the way in which that system will read motion and the way you'll use it to trigger whatever media. So that's part of it. It's kind of like a 3-part process. There's the motion sensing system that's putting the data in and how you decide to make it interpret that data, and then the interactive structures and the behavior design through which that stuff gets filtered, and then the delivery system, which is basically also the content, your interactive design, your structures, how you're thinking about what it will do.
So do you have to do some of your own programming in that system, or is it something that automatically happens? It's pre-programmed?
It doesn't automatically happen. It definitely doesn't automatically happen. No, the guy in Toronto, David has created a system that has a software object that opens in Max, which is an interactive programming language. And so that, his system has a certain, it's like a little software application. And then you can design how that's going to work, but then you have to, Max is a programming language that basically lets you design behaviors and route all the you basically create your own software using the programming language of Max.
Right.
So
is it used in any other industries? This software, is it a software that is used commercially in any industry?
Max, Max, I don't know. Actually, it's a program that was developed by David Ziccarelli and Miller Puckett at IRCOM in Paris. It's a commercially available software package. I don't know. I'm sure people are using it for all sorts of things. Rock and roll generation.
To this question a little bit, it would be useful, particularly for students, if you could talk a little bit about the process, production and collaboration, and what it involves and how long it takes to develop a complex piece such as this one.
Well, Artificial Changelings took 4 years to develop. And it started out, when I first started out with it, it was a process of working with a programmer and doing a lot of experimenting with, first with the hardware. We started out working with something called the Sensor Lab box, which is from Stime, which is a place in the Netherlands that develops interactive music, mostly interactive instruments that they help work with artists to construct. And it's basically a real-world to MIDI converter, which means that it takes MIDI data or serial port data, and it takes any kind of electrical input from any sort of interface device. You could hook up your, like any kind of keypad to it, and you put a voltage regulator on it, and you stick it into this machine, and it turns it into MIDI data. It allows you a tremendous amount of flexibility in terms of inventing interfaces. So initially I had a little control panel and a video marionette. I was creating a character, the idea that I had force sensing resistors and sliders and switches and infrared sensors and ultrasound. And we're just sort of experimenting with, like what the interface would be. And I started to take the ultrasound emitter and receiver, and if you have one in each hand and you go like this in the air, you can play a scale in sound pretty accurately. But I didn't want to have people, I didn't want like the receiver on the screen and the emitter stuck on some kind of sandwich board that people had to wear or something. So I was trying to figure out how to make it so that you wouldn't have to work, you wouldn't have to wear anything or have anything interfering with the experience. And so I took the emitter and the receiver and put them next to each other and discovered that if you kind of patted the air over them, you could make the air scream. And that started to kind of be interesting. So I threw the control panel out the window, and I started to work with some souped up ultrasound sensors that I had found from, they make them for RV vehicles so that you can put this thing on the front and rear end of your dashboard and it gives you a digital readout, so that you don't back into the car in front of you. And they were kind of souped up in some way. And I realized, and I started playing with them, and I realized that they could read the human body relatively accurately from about 10 feet. So I was sort of playing with that, and then I started talking to the people at Stime and to some other kinds of interactive music people, and they said, well, you should try video motion sensing because ultrasound doesn't really read the human body all that accurately. So I moved over into ultrasound, and that was sort of the start of working with that interface. And then as we started developing the interface, we started experimenting with behaviors. A lot of the behaviors for this piece that I showed you were developed using a Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers laser disc. So we would be doing these things where we, kind of whoop, keep Ginger in the air, and so kind of taking different segments of that video and using the laser disc to the interface design to kind of develop the behaviors. And while I was developing the behaviors, I was writing my script, writing my my stories, developing my characters, and beginning to create the idea for how I wanted to design the interface, like the idea of using this kind of idea of emotional closeness and farness, like how you would, if you were close to the screen, you would be in an intimate space as you backed up. So there was like an actual physical metaphor in all the interactive structures for for the content of the piece, because there isn't anything at this point in interface that disappears as much as turning a page. So I feel that the interface design has to have metaphors. So there was this whole process of designing the behaviors, writing the script, creating a kind of conversation between the two. And during that period, I was doing a lot of fundraising. I spent a lot of time doing fundraising, a lot. And the bigger they get, the more fundraising you have to do. So what can I say? So this new piece is bigger, and I'm spending even more time doing fundraising. So, and so that's, basically the process goes through that. Then once I get the interactive structures and the script down, then I start working with actors, costume, people to develop costumes, makeup, people who are going to help me with sets or, work on that kind of thing. And at that point, it becomes like shooting an independent film. But we're shooting it. We're shooting the film. Like when I sit down with a DP and create a shooting script, we're shooting it to a set of interactive behaviors. So we're authoring it quite differently than you would author a film. And so a lot of the conventional kind of shot structures of film don't work in this kind of context. So you have to. So for me, I have to really understand the whole structure of the interactivity and exactly what it's going to be doing, so that I can shoot and author to it. And then post-production on this piece took about 1.5 years. It was like doing Terminator 2 in your living room with an NEA grant. So it took a long time. And I had a few people who were working on it with me, doing 3D animation and some of those kind of things, but I did a lot of the post-production myself. And then we made laser discs and did the final navigation programming. In other words, once the laser discs were made and we had recorded a lot of the sound, I'd worked with a composer, just in the same way that you would do like a film soundtrack. Then we did this thing where we had to compile the whole thing, and then I had to work with a programmer in order to work out how the navigation was going to work, how all these elements and all these behaviors and all these different pieces of things would work together and be stable in some way, and how, what the actual nuts and bolts mechanics of that would be. And and then you put then we designed the pads and did the built the screen and worked on those kind of final things, and then got the shipping cases. So that's about.
Hi, the work's fantastic. I just wanted to go back to this issue of the database, because it's really interesting to me, and I'm curious just to hear you talk more about what's still a relatively kind of fixed or stable database in a sense in terms of the way you're constructing it. And as you move more toward a potentially multi-user kind of console system within the space of someone's living room, and the kinds of possibilities that you might have as you adopt some of these gaming design metaphors or technologies, even thinking about something like an extensible database or a kind of level editing tool that would allow people, I'm just curious if you've thought about these things, how you feel about it in relation to your own work or creative process.
I was just actually talking this morning to some people at a game company here in town, and one of the things that I find really fascinating about the possibilities with some of the graphic game engines that are developing is the potential for for emergent behaviors. But at the same time, in terms of what I'm interested in, what I do, there's certain kinds of collision points that are very difficult to figure out. Because I'm interested in narrative being immersive, but I'm interested in it being prescripted. In other words, I want to tell you a story. There are environments in which you can create a kind of mise-en-scène and a set of character possibilities for people to adopt, which then become a social space in which a narrative can emerge. And I think that that's a very interesting kind of space. I don't think it's necessarily that interesting in terms of narrative, but I think that it's a socially interesting space, and that it engages people in something that is in fact a narrative. I'm interested in the way in which narrative can be made immersive, and the way in which you can kind of put a character on almost like a smart costume. I'm thinking about this new piece as an immersive date movie, with karaoke flirting, where you get to put on one character and somebody else gets to put on the other character, and there are places where it's like you get to engage in a kind of Howard Hawks flirting scenario, and it's like you don't have to come up with the story yourself. You don't have, I'm not so interested in that. I like having a story told to me. But when you're wearing the character in that way, and there's a certain kind of cooperation necessary, it sort of puts you into the environment in a way that physicalizes it and makes it into into a kind of relationship you're having with another person through this interface, and those are some of the things that interest me. The idea of responsiveness over choice, because most of the choice is like the kind of choice you have between 14 different kinds of toilet paper, in the supermarket. A lot of the metaphors of choice and interactivity are in fact entirely. A lot of them are very prescripted and very determined, and some of the things that are actually being pushed in the gaming industry as the most interactive are in fact, I find when I look at them in closer up and talk with the programmers and talk about what's happening, that they in fact don't have that much more interactive latitude than what I'm doing with video, with a kind of reanimation of video, which is in fact a kind of kludge on a linear medium. So there's a lot of I think there's a lot of very interesting things potentials that are coming out of the gaming industry, and I'm very interested in the possibility of kind of fusing them with what I do, where there might be alleys that you could go down where you would be able to access some of those technologies. And I'm actually talking to some of these people about, kind of experimenting with working on some of those things. So, yeah.
I just wasn't sure, was the video made after the installation, or was the installation part of the video?
Let's see. This demo video, the whole first segment of it is actual video segments from the piece.
Okay.
But rather than being something that was shot when the installation was up, in other words, I could plug in to the video out during a show of the piece, for instance, and give you a kind of run through of somebody's interactive version of the piece. But the piece, when I did the demo tape, the piece wasn't completely assembled yet. So I think that so that I took the basic footage and then simulated some of the interactivity, and then the footage at the end is from the actual piece in an installation. So yes, a lot of that footage is footage that's actually in the piece, but it's acting as if.
Right. And the new piece you're making also for gallery space?
I'm making it I'm making it as a piece that can be performed by two people for an audience in a theatrical context, that can be shown as an installation because it's a serial. It could be shown, as smaller chunks as an installation that travels to museums and film festivals. And then I'm also engaged right now in porting both of them to some kind of living room-based console so that you can do it in the living room. I think maybe Xbox, which is the new Microsoft game platform, because it's a little bit more like a computer. Although I'm interested in PlayStation 2, although they're really controlling there. And it costs $20,000 to become a developer. I asked. I heard 20, but maybe it's gotten cheaper. Right here? Yeah.
Do you have any advice for students or people that are beginning to work in new technologies, where in a sense, for you have very high-level ideas about what you want to communicate and get at, but at the same time the technology is very hard to learn? How do you approach that in your own work? How do you deal with this kind of frustration about the technology?
I don't feel frustrated about the technology. I just think it's fun, and I think that, and I get intrigued by things, and I look at stuff and I think, what else could I do with that? It's like I started out using slide dissolve units that were designed to do corporate shows, and I used them to put, like vibrating angels in the trees. You just look at something and you say, that's really cool. What else could I do with that? So I would recommend the subversive abuse of technology as a platform. And I would say that to begin with, that everything you look at has a possibility to do something else, and some of the other stuff you could do with it is going to be a whole lot more fun than what it was designed to do, and that this is like, this is interesting, and you start from there, and it gradually kind of evolves, and people say, how did you learn all this stuff? Well, I just kind of picked it up, you just start somewhere, and then you take it a step at a time. So I think it's important to be where you are so that you're not worrying about where you should be. I think that it's, I think it's important to, engage in the subversive abuse of technology. And I think it's incredibly important to think to spend time thinking, reading, researching, and thinking about the content of what you want to do, and considering that period of time as work. And one of the things that I'm noticing with a lot of the students that I work with is that they feel somehow like reading or writing or thinking about that kind of stuff isn't really work, and they should get right to production. But you need an armature. And that armature of content and ideas is going to be the thing that feeds how you design an interface, why you do what you do, you know, why somebody else is going to want to do it at all. And that will get you into a situation where if you're working with interactive media, you know, somebody will come into your piece and the content of the piece won't be how long it takes them to figure out how it works. Because that's one of the things that I notice in a lot of interactive work, that people stay for, you know, they get into it and they look at it and they stay for as long as it takes to figure it out how it works, and then they leave because that seems to be what the piece is about. So I think it's incredibly important to think about, you know, the deeper content of what you're doing. And this is a great medium. I mean, you can make it up as you go along. There's nobody telling you what to do. That's what I like about it.
Can you tell us a little bit about your background, how you got to this place?
Let's see.
A compressed version.
Yeah. It's like, I started out as a painter, and I worked for a whole number of years sort of as a kind of painter who was kind of screwing around with things and putting things in big plexiglass boxes and making things three-dimensional. And there was a certain point where trying to push painting into this other place just became kind of problematic, and people kind of reacted like you'd peed on their shoe or something. And I just decided it would be better to start with something that didn't have such an entrenched history of behavior in it. And so I sort of just started drifting away from that kind of media, and I started working with computerized slide projectors and video and three-dimensional scrims, and starting to make things that were like pulling the movie off the wall and into the room with you. I was also very interested in narrative, and in a lot of contemporary painting that was like a glass hill. It was very hard to try to pull those elements into painting. There was a lot of resistance to it. So I just kind of got rid of it and started to find myself in this thing that was kind of like where I could make movies all by myself, although I don't do it all by myself anymore, as you notice from the credit list. But and that's also one part of what I like a lot about this medium, is the collaborative nature about it. And of the fact that you invite people into your work, and that you open up a space in your own work for other people to work in, and that process of letting go of pieces of what you do creates a kind of range and richness in your work that you just aren't really capable of creating on your own. So that's part of the benefit, I think, of collaborative work.
So Toni, a question from a little bit different angle. So are you sort of like bothered by the fact that actually, relatively speaking, quite fairly rather, I mean, it's difficult to experience this kind of work. So it's shown in a couple of exhibitions, but most of the people anyway get to see it as a demo videotape, actually. And I think this is even more the case with your previous work. So the really interesting piece, which is called The Archaeology of the Mother Tongue, which is a sort of like very innovative virtual reality movie that I was glad to experience myself, but I mean that very few people in the world have ever had a chance to try that one. So are you looking for solutions actually to this problem of making these kind of experiences more widely available?
Yeah, definitely. I'm very much so, because archaeology of a mother tongue became what I call famous vaporware, and it was on a very expensive platform that you could never get nobody could ever afford to get in a gallery, and the code was all over the place, and reconstructing it on anything would be a nightmare at this point. And so, I think it's part of the reason that I'm interested in the Xbox. It's part of the reason that I'm trying to develop some of these interface devices that that I'm using. I'm trying to right now work out ways of putting them in a, like using low-end USB kind of peripherals that could make them operate within a living room context. And what I'd really like to do is create a kind of large-scale spectacle, theatrical kind of experience that would be like a kind of virtuoso performance of the instrument, the movie instrument, and then let people take a, have a disc that they could take home where they can play with it themselves. And that would be ideal for me, is to be able to have both poles of that, the kind of scale and spectacle and fun of something that occurs in a public space, and that but also the kind of richness and the possibility of repeatability and of a different kind of depth of relationship that could come out of a living room scenario. So yeah, I am trying to get into your living room. I am working on this. There are people working with me on it. Yes, so yes. Yeah.
I have a question kind of in regards to the popular but maybe antiquated notion that working with computers sort of implies a disembodiment of the individual and are like a giving up of the individual agency. But I noticed a lot in your presentation you kept saying you have the choice, you do this, your movement determines this outcome. And I was wondering sort of what you have to say about the future of man-machine communication and like that sort of psychological idea that it's frightening.
I think part of what's really interesting to me, and what I was talking about really earlier on about the whole notion of interface design, is that there has been a tremendous amount of rhetoric about disembodiment, about the meat puppet, about this idea that you can leave the body behind. And my feeling is that if you leave the body behind, you're going with it. I don't think it's not going anywhere. But I think what is incredibly interesting within the context of this space is that our constructions about what the body is, our intellectual constructions about what constitutes the body, are changing in the context of these new technologies, and within this profound shift in the means of production, which is altering social relationships, the construction of public and private space, gender definitions, divisions of labor, all kinds of things are changing within this shift in the means of production. And also, along with that, our construction of our own identities and our construction of perception and of the body. And that's what I was saying before about the notion of this kind of recasting of the invisible that's happening, that what I would call a kind of materialistic static. The fact that there can be a kind of ordinary experience of something that has been traditionally cast as a kind of paranormal or extrasensory kind of perception, that this sense of our bodies as having powers within the invisible spheres, is in fact becoming a kind of ordinary experience. And that what's interesting to me about this is not the way it disembodies us, but the way in which it changes our concept of what the body is. And the way it's almost like we're becoming aware of muscles we didn't know we had. Children are will within this context develop perceptions that you and I don't have. This is this is part of the way our perceptual apparatus actually operates, and I think that this is actually fascinating and extremely embodied. And so I think that what's frightening is not the technologies, and sometimes the technologies get presented as if they were agentless and self-enclosed, and that there's a whole kind of historical continuum of economic agendas that inform the evolution of various technologies. And if there are things that frighten us, it comes from those economic agendas that are very embodied. They're coming from, from economic interests, from global capital, from a whole set of values and agendas that guide this technology. But it's a Brechtian moment. You can, as these things evolve, they don't have to go in any given direction. I mean, there's possibilities for intervention. There's possibilities for critical discourse. There's ways of there's many possible ways for these things to develop, and that really depends on the value systems of our cultures and the economic structures. So that people scare me, not technology.
I'm almost always the last question, so I'll make it very brief.
That's good. That's a good place to be.
I'll try to make it brief now. If you imagine that, you work in theater in a sense, you work in cinema in a sense, and you work in something like a kind of novel in a sense also. Yeah. And each one of them has some kind of arc. You might say a kind of story arc that evolved out of, I don't know, the political culture of its time, like melodrama in the 19th century, or cinema and melodrama and so on. And here we are, as you say, in this eccentrically re-embodied and potentially dangerously embodied moment. So you imagine a narrative that not so much has a beginning and a middle and an end, but has a kind of arc. An arc that isn't Greek theater, that isn't Hollywood melodrama, that isn't neo-noir, that isn't just a performance piece. And you're closer to getting a sense of what these arcs might mean than certainly I am. So I'd be curious to know what sense of an arc and completion you see. What length of time, what length of process. I don't think there's an answer to that, but I have a feeling you're closer to what this is heading.
You mean in terms of where we will end up with these syntax?
Yeah, we're obviously going to come up with syntax that has a narrative. A narrative means some sort of an arc. I don't know whether even the word ending is what we're looking for, but the arc is evolving, and the arc will in some way be conditioned by the political economy, the way that we're living, and we're so many people orbiting around it. I don't think you have an answer, but I'd just be curious to see.
I haven't got a clue.
But do you understand what I mean?
Yeah.
Wow, that's encouraging for all of us.
Yeah,
you spend 75 times more time than we have.
I think that there like there's all sorts of convergences between media happening in the living room. I think that things that I think that there's going to be a pipeline coming into the house where you can work on the computer or you can, view things on your living room. And I think as that convergence happens, it will broaden out certain kinds of media that are developing so that they impact on a broader audience. I think there will be simultaneously some kind of spectacle version of new media that occurs in public spaces, and there's already beginning to be these kind of special effects places where the IMAX theater or booths where 6 people can be interactive in virtual reality, and but I don't think any of this is really where it's going to go yet. I think we're somewhere in between the zoetrope and where Edison electrocuted the elephant.
Yes.
So I really wouldn't, and people keep saying they're looking for the D.W. Griffith, and if we're lucky, we might.
I think we're stuck in 1903 or something.
Yeah. I don't think we're stuck at all. As a matter of fact, I think we're accelerating at giddy speed. I think at this particular point, there's so many things going on. And it's so destabilized, and it's shifting around so much that there'll be some point where there, in terms of what becomes a dominant cultural medium, there's a point in which things gel, and there becomes a production apparatus, a financial apparatus, a distribution apparatus, and then a different kind of syntax tends to evolve. And I just don't think we're there yet, and I wouldn't want to be the person who tried to say what it was going to look like.
I know it wasn't meant as a trick question.
It's going to look like my stuff.
That's, okay. I agree.
Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you.